Every textbook tells you the modern world was born in the factories of England. You are taught that brilliant British inventors, armed with steam engines and a tireless work ethic, single-handedly sparked the Industrial Revolution. It is a story of unmatched Western genius. It is a story that frames Europe as the natural, inevitable engine of human progress. It is a narrative that justifies the wealth of the West as the natural reward for their superior intelligence and hard work. It is also a massive, multi-trillion-dollar cover-up. The smoking chimneys of Manchester and London were not fueled by European innovation. They were fueled by the largest, most violent corporate heist in the history of the human race. The West did not industrialize because they were simply smarter than everyone else. They industrialized because they systematically and violently destroyed the manufacturing base of the East. This is the buried record. And today, we are peeling back the layers on the $45 trillion heist and the real engine of the Industrial Revolution. What follows is the story they absolutely do not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let's start by looking at the official story, the version of history you were tested on in school. The year is roughly 1750. Britain is framed as a bustling hub of brilliant tinkerers. Men like James Watt are perfecting the steam engine. Richard Arkwright is inventing the water frame. The spinning jenny is revolutionizing the production of thread. We are told that Britain simply embraced the scientific method, harnessed the power of coal, and proudly ushered humanity out of the agricultural age and into the modern era. This narrative is incredibly powerful. It created the foundational myth of modern capitalism. It tells us that in a free and open market, the smartest and most industrious nation will naturally rise to the top. It tells us that Britain became the workshop of the world simply because they built a better workshop. But if you actually dig into the economic records of the 17th and 18th centuries, that beautiful narrative completely collapses. To understand the sheer scale of the lie, you have to look at what the global economy actually looked like before the Industrial Revolution. If you zoom out from the tiny island of Britain and look at the rest of the planet, a terrifying reality emerges for the West. Britain was not the economic center of the world. They were barely a footnote. For hundreds of years leading up to the Industrial Revolution, the undisputed, unchallenged economic powerhouse of the planet was India. Under the Mughal Empire, the Indian subcontinent was an absolute manufacturing juggernaut. They were not just growing spices or farming agriculture. They were mass-producing highly complex, heavily refined manufactured goods. They were producing advanced steel. They were building massive trading ships. But their absolute greatest weapon, the commodity that completely dominated the global market, was textiles. Today, we take cheap, comfortable clothing for granted. But in the 17th century, clothing was incredibly labor-intensive and expensive. In Europe, the average person wore garments made of heavy wool or rough linen. It was incredibly uncomfortable. It was hot, it was itchy, and it was notoriously difficult to wash. And more importantly, European dyers had no idea how to make colors stick to the fabric. If you washed a dyed European shirt, the color would immediately bleed out. Europe was quite literally a drab, gray, and uncomfortable place to live. Then, the ships of the British East India Company started bringing back massive shipments of Indian cotton. The Indian textile industry was centuries ahead of anything in Europe. Indian weavers and artisans produced fabrics like calico, chintz, and muslin. These fabrics were an absolute revelation to the European consumer. They were incredibly lightweight and breathable. They were woven with a level of precision that European looms could not even comprehend. A piece of high-quality Indian muslin was so fine and so sheer that it was said you could pull an entire dress through a small ring. But the real secret weapon was the chemistry. Indian artisans had mastered the incredibly complex science of chemical mordants. This allowed them to permanently dye their cotton with brilliant, vibrant colors. You could wash an Indian chintz 100 times, and the massive, beautiful floral patterns would never fade. When these Indian textiles hit the markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam, they caused an absolute sensation. The demand was completely insatiable. Everyone, from the wealthiest aristocrats to the everyday working-class maids, wanted to wear Indian cotton. Nobody wanted to wear itchy English wool ever again. And this is where the crisis begins. This is the part of the economic history that the textbooks deliberately skip over. Britain was facing a massive, catastrophic trade deficit. They were importing millions of pieces of Indian textiles every single year, but they had a severe problem. India did not want to buy anything that Britain made. British wool was completely useless in the hot Indian climate. British manufacturing was vastly inferior to Indian manufacturing. There was absolutely nothing the West could produce that the East actually needed. So, how did Britain pay for all these beautiful clothes? They had to pay in cold, hard cash. They were literally emptying their national treasuries of silver and gold bullion and shipping it directly to India. Britain was bleeding wealth. The Indian textile industry was so vastly superior, so incredibly efficient, and so competitively priced that it was actively bankrupting the British economy. The British textile manufacturers, the men who spun wool and wove silk, were completely devastated. They could not compete in a free market. They were being outproduced, out-innovated, and outpriced by an Eastern superpower. The situation became so desperate that the British government had to step in and completely abandon their supposed love for free market capitalism. In the early 1700s, the British Parliament passed a series of brutal protectionist laws known as the Calico Acts. They literally made it illegal for a British citizen to wear a printed Indian shirt. If you were caught walking down the streets of London wearing imported Indian cotton, you would be heavily fined. They banned the importation of Indian textiles entirely. They did not ban them because they were inferior. They banned them because they were perfect. The British government had to build a massive artificial legal wall around their island just to keep their own domestic industries from completely collapsing under the weight of Eastern superiority. But even with the bans in place, the smuggling was rampant. The demand was simply too high. Britain realized the terrifying economic truth. As long as India possessed its massive, highly efficient manufacturing base, Britain would never, ever be able to dominate the global economy. They could not outcompete the Indian weavers. They could not invent a machine fast enough to beat the Indian artisans. In a fair economic fight, the West was losing, badly. So, Britain decided to stop fighting fair. If they could not compete economically, they would compete militarily. They realized that the only way to build the British Industrial Revolution was to systematically and violently destroy the Indian Industrial Revolution. And they didn't do it with a national army. They did it with a rogue, ruthless, heavily armed corporation. The British East India Company was about to stop acting like a trading firm and start acting like an empire. And the violence they were about to unleash on the manufacturing centers of Bengal would become the dark, bloody fuel that powered the modern Western world. In 1757, a heavily armed corporate army belonging to the British East India Company marched onto the battlefield at Plassey. They were not fighting for the British crown. They were fighting for corporate shareholders. And when they defeated the Nawab of Bengal, they did not just win a battle. They executed a hostile takeover of the wealthiest, most productive province on the face of the earth. This is the exact moment the timeline of global wealth permanently fractures. Before 1757, Britain had to pay for Indian textiles with silver and gold. But after the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company took over the tax collection of Bengal. They suddenly had access to the massive tax revenues of millions of Indian citizens, and they used a brilliant, terrifyingly ruthless accounting trick to drain the subcontinent dry. The company started using the tax money they collected from the Indian people to buy the textiles produced by the Indian weavers. Think about the sheer, predatory genius of that system. They were no longer trading. They were no longer paying for goods out of their own pockets. They were using India's own money to buy India's own products, and then shipping those products back to Europe to be sold for a massive 100% profit. It was a perfectly engineered mechanism for absolute wealth extraction. But the corporate greed did not stop at the tax code. To completely dominate the market, the East India Company had to guarantee that Indian textiles remained artificially cheap, and they had to make sure no Indian weaver could ever compete against a British factory. So, they unleashed a system of corporate terrorism. The East India Company established an absolute monopoly over the weavers of Bengal. If you were a highly skilled Indian artisan, you were no longer allowed to sell your beautiful chintz or muslin in a free market. You were legally forced to sell exclusively to the East India Company, at prices dictated entirely by the company. These prices were deliberately set so low that the weavers could barely afford to feed their own families. If a weaver tried to sell their cloth to a Dutch or French merchant who was willing to pay a fair price, the punishment was swift and brutal. The company deployed armed thugs called gomastas. They would raid the weavers' villages. They would smash their looms. They would publicly flog them. The historical record from this era is filled with dark, horrifying accounts. The conditions became so brutal and the forced labor so agonizing that there are recorded instances of highly skilled Indian weavers actively cutting off their own thumbs. They permanently mutilated themselves, just so the British East India Company could no longer force them to work. They were not out-innovated by Western steam engines. They were physically broken by corporate mercenaries. And as the Indian manufacturing base was systematically crushed, a massive tidal wave of stolen wealth began flowing directly into the banks of London. Renowned economists who have meticulously studied the tax records and trade deficits of this era have calculated the true cost of this extraction. Between 1765 and 1938, the British Empire drained an estimated $45 trillion of wealth from the Indian subcontinent. $45 trillion. That is a number so massive it breaks the human imagination. It is more than the GDP of the United States and China combined today. And this is where the buried record completely destroys the myth of the Western genius. Where do you think the capital came from to build the massive, sprawling brick factories of Manchester? Where did the funding come from to experiment with James Watt's steam engines? Where did the British government get the massive financial reserves required to build the most powerful navy on Earth, which then protected their global supply chains? It did not magically spring from the Protestant work ethic. It did not materialize because the British were inherently better at science. The Industrial Revolution was heavily subsidized by the looted capital of the East. The massive wealth extracted from Bengal acted as the financial rocket fuel for the British industrial transition. And once the British had finally built their steam-powered textile mills using stolen Indian money, they enacted the final, most devastating phase of the heist. They completely reversed the global supply chain. For centuries, India had exported finished, highly valuable manufactured goods, and Britain had exported raw materials. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain used their colonial power to flip the board completely. They placed massive, crushing tariffs on any finished Indian textiles trying to enter Britain. But they forced India to drop all of their own tariffs. India was violently deindustrialized. The workshops of Bengal were shuttered. The massive shipyards were closed down. India was forced to become nothing more than a massive agricultural plantation. Their only role in the new global economy was to grow raw cotton, ship it thousands of miles to the factories of England, and then be forced to buy back the finished, machine-woven shirts at a premium. In 1750, before the British East India Company arrived, India commanded roughly 25% of the entire global GDP. By the time the British finally left in 1947, India's share of the global economy had been completely decimated, dropping to less than 3%. The West looks at this massive shift and proudly calls it the age of industrialization. The buried record calls it the age of deindustrialization. This is the ultimate perception overturn. When you look at a map of the world today, the terminology we use is entirely shaped by this cover-up. We look at nations in Western Europe and North America, and we call them developed nations. We assume they reached that status through their own hard work, their own brilliant inventors, and their own superior economic systems. We look at nations like India, and we call them developing nations. We use that word as if they are simply behind on the timeline of human progress, as if they just haven't figured out how to build a modern economy yet. But the buried record proves that is a catastrophic lie. India is not a developing nation. India is a recovering nation. They were not naturally behind. They were actively, systematically, and violently underdeveloped by Western corporate policy. Their industries were not defeated by better technology. They were defeated by a corporate army that rewrote the tax code and smashed the thumbs of their best engineers. The modern Western world was not built on a foundation of free market capitalism. It was built on a foundation of monopoly, militarized trade, and a $45 trillion extraction. Britain did not win the economic race because they ran faster. They won the race because they shot the lead runner in the legs, stole his shoes, and then claimed they were simply the superior athlete. The next time someone tells you the Industrial Revolution was a triumph of Western ingenuity, Remember the weavers of Bengal. History is rarely driven by the smartest inventor in the room. It is usually driven by whoever is willing to be the most ruthless. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the historical ledgers of the East India Company. It is in the parliamentary records of London. The $45 trillion heist is a mathematical reality. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the Industrial Revolution and the wealth of the modern world, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we will keep digging. But the mechanics of this $45 trillion heist did not stop at simply smashing looms and changing tariffs. To truly drain a subcontinent, you need infrastructure. And this brings us to one of the greatest historical illusions of the British Empire. If you ask a defender of Western colonialism what the British actually did for India, they will almost always point to the exact same thing: the railways. Textbooks proudly claim that Britain brought modern transportation, engineering, and connectivity to the East. It is framed as a benevolent gift of civilization. It is used as proof that the British Empire was ultimately a force for good. The buried record reveals that the Indian railway system was not a gift. It was a highly specialized, ruthlessly efficient extraction pipeline. The railways were not built to connect Indian citizens or to foster internal domestic trade. If you look at the original maps of the railway lines, they do not connect Indian cities to each other. They connect the deep agricultural interior directly to the major coastal ports: Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. They were designed with one single, highly specific purpose: to extract raw materials like cotton, coal, and indigo from the heart of the country and pump them directly onto British ships bound for London. And here is the most infuriating layer of the railway myth. The British did not even pay for them. The railways were built using Indian tax money, but the contracts to build them were given exclusively to British engineering firms. The steel was bought exclusively from British factories, and to fund the construction, the British government offered guaranteed, artificially high interest returns to British investors, and those returns were paid entirely by Indian taxpayers. It was a massive, risk-free transfer of wealth. India was forced to pay for the exact machinery that was being used to loot them, and the human cost of this massive extraction pipeline was absolutely apocalyptic. As the British East India Company, and later the British Crown, tightened its grip on the Indian economy, they forced a massive shift in agriculture. Indian farmers were no longer allowed to grow food to feed their own villages. They were violently coerced into growing cash crops: indigo for dyes, poppies for opium, and most importantly, raw cotton to feed the voracious textile mills of Manchester. When you force an entire continent to stop growing food, the mathematics of human survival collapse. In the late 19th century, a series of devastating droughts hit the Indian subcontinent. Drought is a natural phenomenon, but famine is a political choice. Because the agricultural system had been completely re-engineered for corporate export, there were no regional grain reserves. Millions of Indian citizens began to starve. But the trains did not stop running. While the streets of major Indian cities were filled with the dying, the British-built railways continued to operate with ruthless efficiency. They were transporting thousands of tons of Indian wheat and grain directly past starving villages, loading them onto ships and exporting them to Europe. The British Viceroy at the time, Lord Lytton, explicitly ordered that there should be no interference with the free market. He declared that British merchants must be allowed to export grain for profit, even as millions of the people who grew that grain starved to death. This is not a Dark Age myth. This happened in the age of the telegraph, the steam engine, and the modern corporation. It is estimated that between 12 and 29 million Indians died in the late Victorian famines. They did not die because of a lack of food on the subcontinent. They died because their food was loaded onto trains they paid for, to be sold in the markets of the empire that conquered them. This is the true, buried engine of the Industrial Revolution. It is a story of blood, forced labor, and systematic starvation. The West looks at this massive, global shift and proudly calls it the age of industrialization. They build monuments to their inventors and their economic systems. But this is the ultimate perception overturn. When you look at a map of the world today, The terminology we use in our textbooks and our news networks is entirely shaped by this cover-up. We look at nations in Western Europe and North America, and we proudly call them developed nations. We assume they reach that status through their own hard work, their own brilliant inventors, and their own superior economic theories. We look at nations like India, and we call them developing nations. We use that word as if they are simply behind on the timeline of human progress, as if they just haven't figured out how to build a modern economy yet. But the buried record proves that is a catastrophic lie. India is not a developing nation. India is a recovering nation. They were not naturally behind. They were actively, systematically, and violently underdeveloped by Western corporate policy. Their industries were not defeated by better technology. They were defeated by a corporate army that rewrote the tax code and smashed the thumbs of their best engineers. The modern Western world was not built on a foundation of free market capitalism. It was built on a foundation of monopoly, militarized trade, and a $45 trillion extraction. Britain did not win the economic race because they ran faster. They won the race because they shot the lead runner in the legs, stole his shoes, and then claimed they were simply the superior athlete. The next time someone tells you the Industrial Revolution was a pure triumph of Western ingenuity, remember the weavers of Bengal. Remember the extraction trains. History is rarely driven by the smartest inventor in the room. It is usually driven by whoever is willing to be the most ruthless. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the historical ledgers of the East India Company. It is in the parliamentary records of London. The $45 trillion heist is a mathematical reality. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the Industrial Revolution and the wealth of the modern world, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.